Jakob, I was trying to think of a robust defense for prohibiting hate speech online. We think at the Free Speech Union that Nadine Dorries, the Secretary of State at DCMS, which is the Department of State responsible for the online safety bill, will follow up the online safety bill with some supplementary legislation in which she identifies the harms which social media companies will have a particular obligation to remove. And we're fairly confident that she's going to stipulate that hate speech, removing hate speech, should be a priority. But she means legal but harmful speech. She's not going to, in this supplementary legislation, do anything to encourage social media companies to remove illegal content. That's all taken care of in the bill itself. The supplementary legislation will urge them to remove legal but harmful content, including hateful content. Now, the rationale for that is that if you allow people, even if they don't stray outside the law, to say hateful things about historically disadvantaged groups, about women, about black people, about homosexuals, about transgendered people, the claim is that that will discourage them from participating in a debate, in the national conversation, in what has become the digital public square. And various bits of evidence can be cited, research showing that historically disadvantaged groups are likely to be put off if they think there are going to be these voices attacking them in the public square. So the argument is, in order to maximize free speech, in order to maximize participation in public debate, we have to restrict the speech of those who are going to say things which may not be unlawful, but which would have the effect of discouraging these historically disadvantaged groups from participating in these vital public debates. How do you respond to that?
Earlier today, I was running up to Arthur's seat, and I was close to spraining my wrist. And so, an analogy could be, well, if that had happened, it should be amputated in order to save it. No, I think it's a really poor argument. First of all, which specific groups does this pertain to, and how do you define hate? During the Cold War, when the United Nations was debating international human rights conventions, the role of free speech came up, and the countries that wanted to have an obligation to prohibit hate speech under international human rights law were it was the Soviet bloc. So they came with these proposals from the 1936 Stalin constitution in the Soviet Union that prohibited hate speech. And the British representative gave at one point a very remarkable speech saying that, even during the Battle of Britain, you could go into a bookstore and you could buy Mein Kampf. And so Britain would continue to fight for its conception of freedom of speech as robustly as it had fought against the Nazism during the war. And I thought that was a very persuasive answer, completely different from what you hear today. And I think obviously there's going to be people who are put off by hateful or distasteful comments online, but at the same time, it is never, minorities have never had a better opportunity for speaking out publicly than today. So, for instance, if you go to America, the Black Lives Matter protest, for instance, if that had taken place in the South in the 1950s, those who had participated would have been arrested and beaten up. So someone like Martin Luther King was arrested 29 times. John Lewis, the great civil rights hero, was arrested in Dallas for standing with a sign saying "One man, one vote." And it is the robust protection of free speech under the First Amendment that some progressives today want to limit that ensures that. So that's of course there's a cost of participating in a robust free debate. You might hear things that you dislike. That is unavoidable. But I think that one of the remedies is that those of us who are in favor of even allowing hate speech have a moral obligation to denounce those who. So if someone attacks, if a neo-Nazi attacks a racial minority, the Free Speech Union, someone like you should extend your moral support for that person and denounce the person engaging in racism. That is a much, I think, stronger way of countering hateful speech than trying to limit it through restrictive measures.
One of the most common arguments made against the Free Speech Union and the efforts we engage in to protect people who are being mobbed on social media and who are being bullied in order to silence them is that actually the bullies are just exercising their right to free speech. So when the Green government minister denounces gender-critical feminists, opponents of the gender reform, the Gender Recognition Act reform bill, as anti-Semites and transphobes, even though that's a smear and doesn't seem to contribute to a civil, grown-up discussion about an important issue, nonetheless, isn't she just exercising her right to free speech? Couldn't you make the same defence of Grant Butters, the representative of the UCU at Edinburgh University, who described the recently established chapter of the Academics for Academic Freedom at Edinburgh? And I think we have Lindsay Patterson, one of the members of the Scottish Advisory Council, a professor of education policy at Edinburgh and a member of that group here tonight, when he denounces this group as a haven for transphobes, bigots and racists, isn't he just exercising his right to free speech, albeit in a fairly exuberant and unsavoury way?
Yeah, man, I would defend his right to say that. If I were the target of speech like that, I would accept that someone is exercising their right to describe my character as they see it. I have the right to reply. I mean, the key thing is I've got the right to reply. And if I replied, we're in a debate, and there's nothing better for a debate than having an examination of the issues involved in that debate. I'll give you an example from political history. In the 1964 general election, a Tory was elected in a Birmingham seat on the slogan using the N-word. If you want the N-word for a neighbour, vote Liberal or Labour. I mean, this is quite, even then, an extraordinary thing. What then happened was, no one said he shouldn't have had the right to say that. When he arrived in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, in the very first speech he made as Prime Minister, put the finger on him as a political leper. And that caused a great stramash, and there was a great debate, and it began to open up people's minds to the fact of the maltreatment of people who had black skins who happened to live in Birmingham. So the fact that he actually was able to see it, more importantly, was the response started the anti-racist dialogue that has developed over many years inside the United Kingdom. I don't like what folks say about me, by the way. But they've got the right to say it. And as long as it's legal, I'm hunky-dory with that. Doesn't worry me the least little bit, because I've got the right to reply if I choose to exercise it. Sometimes I don't bother. The government minister, I've got no problem with what she said about folk being transphobic and bigotry. Where I have a quarrel with her is that she also argued that people with an opposite point of view to her should be censored. That's much more important.
One of the things which I find a little bit puzzling about the way in which defenders of trans rights prosecute their case in the public square is not to set out an argument and to engage intellectually with gender-critical feminists like Helen Joyce and Kathleen Stock. I mean, it's an important national debate, and it's a conversation we should be having if we want to get the boundaries right. And there does seem to be a genuine conflict between trans rights and sex-based women's rights, and there needs to be a negotiated settlement about that conflict. And there's a complete willingness, seemingly, on the side of the gender-critical feminists to enter into that public debate, but an unwillingness on the part of their opponents. Why is it that they're unwilling to make that argument in the public square? Why do they think that's beneath them, that it would somehow be licensing, giving a platform to people with hateful views? Why the smearing? Why reach for that kind of those low tactics instead of just engaging in a grown-up discussion about it?
I think the reason is that these are zealots. And when you come to a zealot, then the standards that they apply are different from everybody else's. And you just have to live with the zealots. I mean, I am not a woman, as you well know. But I wonder why sometimes women bother with what they say. If you don't bother with what a zealot says, then they don't know what to do next. Because this is my experience in politics, that they require a response. And when it doesn't happen, they're in no man's land. And I think one of the great mistakes that's been made on the side of the women's movement is actually to reply. Is to reply to them. I would ignore them. I mean, just say, away, and as McGarry would say, away and bow your head.
That's the problem. Yeah.
Next off, we have a meeting. We couldn't have a meeting like this tonight. There would have been a big protest outside. The venue would have been told to cancel it, been told we're bigots, and anybody who attended could have faced being reported to their employer or to the police. So we can't ignore them. We'd love to ignore them.
You campaigned against the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act. It got royal assent more than a year ago. And one of the things FSU Scotland would like to do is to create a war chest so we can come to the defence of someone who is prosecuted for a speech crime under that act. But we may be waiting some time because the act hasn't been activated. Can you offer any insight into why it hasn't been activated? Does the Scottish Government, is it not serious about this? Was it sort of a gesture, a sort of a way of giving some sort of succour to some of their more extreme supporters, maybe the Greens, without actually being serious about wanting to actually enforce this new law? Is it because of the opposition of the courts and the police? They think they'll just be deluged with kind of complaints and they'll be kept so busy dealing with all this stuff that they won't be able to actually do anything about serious crimes. Why hasn't it been activated? It's sort of mysterious.
In terms of activating, I think they are deadly serious. I think, the government ignored one of the most wide and serious societal backlashes against this legislation, of any legislation in the UK in recent history. I think Jim described it as one of the most dangerous and pernicious pieces of legislation anywhere in the UK in living memory. The government does want to implement it. I think that it is causing an immense headache to the police and to prosecutors because it is so vague. What is hatred? Hatred is an emotion in the human heart. It's very vague, it's hard to define. The thresholds are still problematic, the free speech provisions, as I said earlier, there's sort of a hierarchy in there, discussion and criticism of transgender identity, but you can express antipathy, dislike, ridicule and abuse against religion. Well, that's a bit different, isn't it? So my guess would be that the police are desperately struggling to come up with guidance to implement this law in a way that does not amount to the policing of debate in society. That is not the role of the police. Police Scotland are there to defend and protect the public, to promote civil liberties and protect free speech. They are not there to look at individual conversations and say whether that's crossed the line into some subjective hatred. And as we've seen with the hate incident framework, that is in, I think, most police forces in the UK and Police Scotland as well, they're taking these kind of initiatives much wider than incitement to imminent violence or harassment or abuse. And my concern is, if the police are already encouraging anybody who thinks they've seen a quote hate incident or might have seen a hate incident to pick up the phone and call 999, what's going to happen when this legislation comes into force? If officers are used to dealing with hate crime and hate incident legislation at a lower threshold, is there going to be crossover? Is there going to be confusion when this law comes into force? And yeah, that's my guess really, and prosecutors as well.
Where are the police when these ladies want to meet to talk about
That's
some of
right.
these
That's a great
issues?
question.
Where are the police then?
Yeah.
Protecting them?
The police should be protecting everybody's legitimate rights to protest bad laws and good laws as well. I think I alluded to this earlier, that we have institutions that are becoming politicised and have done for many years. In education, there's not free and open inquiry in our universities, in our schools, in classrooms as well. There is politicisation, and there is a stifling atmosphere in various parts of society. There is a distinction, thankfully, some distinction between these hate incidents, which is anything anyone anywhere perceives to be motivated by hatred, and the Hate Crime Act, which is intended, abusive or threatening, and intended to stir up hatred. What stirring up and hatred looks like, that's still to be defined, and that's the worry when you have police that are already, let's face it, chasing down feminists for tweeting things which are not offensive in the slightest, but have been perceived offensive by some.
The definition of a woman.
Yes, the dictionary definition of a woman in Scotland apparently is tantamount to a hate incident. And so if the police believe that, how are they going to police this legislation?
The Free Speech Union supported Harry Miller, who won an important victory in the Court of Appeal recently, in which the Court of Appeal said that the recording of non-crime hate incidents by the police, and we think about 200,000 have been recorded in England and Wales alone since 2014, was on the face of it unlawful. And the College of Policing in England and Wales hasn't completely withdrawn its guidance. It's revised it a little bit, and it'll be subject to statutory guidance in due course. But we did have success in getting a police force to delete a non-crime hate incident that was recorded against one of our members. And I think that the Court of Appeal's judgment will apply in Scotland just as it does in England and Wales. So if anyone here is concerned that they may have an NCHI recorded against them and on their criminal record, please come and tell us, and we will write to the relevant Chief Constable and see if we can get it deleted. But the Court of Appeal is a national, is a UK-based court. No. Complains to the police that they think a hostile act directed at someone who has a protected characteristic is motivated by hostility towards that characteristic, then it is classified as either a hate crime, or if not a crime, then a hate incident. And if the police, on investigating this report, conclude that no crime has been committed, instead of just dropping the matter altogether, they are obliged, under this guidance in England and Wales anyway, issued by the College of Policing, to record it as a non-crime hate incident, and it can then show up on your criminal record. So if you apply for a job working with children and your employer does an enhanced DBS check and calls up your criminal record, that can appear on your criminal record and you might not get the job, even though all this records is the fact that you haven't committed a crime. It's a grotesque Orwellian infringement.
I've heard this a lot recently in this context. The whole point is that if you haven't been convicted of anything previously, you don't have a blooming criminal record. You have no record. So in other words, what you're actually saying, and I agree with this, I agree that this is the case, is that if there's a non-crime hate incident attributed to you formally, it creates a criminal record more so than just adding to something that's already there. You don't have any kind of criminal record if you've not been done for anything.
It might help. I'm in correspondence with Police Scotland at the present time. Precisely. Well, I don't think I've done any. So precisely on this. Have they recorded? Now they've tried to dodge it, and I've gone for an FOI. But when I get the result back, I'll be in touch.
Okay. Yeah, well, we can have a go.
And I wouldn't be at all surprised if Police Scotland are doing exactly the same as happened down in England. And so we would have to have a separate case in the Court of Session. But the appeal court in England isn't irrelevant, because in both north and south of the border, they take account of what each jurisdiction's senior lawyers have actually said. It's what they call persuasive. Not binding, but it can be highly persuasive.
So could I then therefore phone the police and make a complaint and say I was offended, upset, which I was, about what Lorna Slater had to say about women who feel and think how we do, and what she said. Do I have that right to do that then?
No,
if they have the right
you're a
to
woman.
say the same of me.
Because after all, according to the logic of non-crime hate incidents, all that's required is that you perceive her comments to be motivated by hostility towards your possession of a protected characteristic, and that it doesn't matter if there's no other evidence or if a reasonable person would conclude otherwise. If your perception, because it's a perception-based non-offence, if your perception is that those remarks were perceived by hostility towards you as a woman, then yes, I think the Police Scotland would be obliged to investigate that, and if they conclude no crime has been committed, to record it as a non-crime hate incident. It's worth a go.
There are 3 words which haven't been used so far tonight, and they're these: defamation, libel, and slander. Now, Toby, you cited Grant Butter's response to the new establishment of the Edinburgh Academics for Academic Freedom group, in which he described that group as, quote, a haven for racists, transphobes, and bigots. You term these to be smears, but I'm going to use a hot word here. What's the intersection between defamation and free speech?
Sometimes members of the FSU come to us and say, I think I've been libelled. Will you help us? Will you help me bring a libel case against this person who's libelled me? And so far, we've only defended people who are defendants in libel cases. We've never actually acted for. We've never helped a plaintiff in a libel case. I don't think we'd rule that out. I mean, I think that you can be a passionate defender of free speech and still not defend people's right to say something false and defamatory that's going to have a really destructive effect on their reputation. So I don't think that you need to denounce the law of libel if you are a defender of free speech. But to date, no case has presented itself to us that we find so compelling that we'd want to act or help a plaintiff.
Women are actually a majority of the population, and we're actually saying very orthodox things, which is that there are 2 sexes, there's men and women, it's immutable, and yet we are being criminalised and attacked and actually terrorised for saying these things. So I suppose my question or my challenge to the panel is, why is it that people are accepting that orthodox views are criminal, should be penalised, should not be spoken? People are being demanded to believe this at their work, that they should say at work, they should compelled speech to say what their pronouns are. I'm a social worker, and social workers are being reported to their regulatory bodies for saying that children belong to one of 2 sexes. They should not be given drugs, puberty blockers. I can see people in this room are not aware of some of the this is now the orthodoxy across the political, not just in Scotland, but terribly more so in Scotland. So I would like to ask the Free Speech Union to have their first public meeting in Scotland on free speech for women, about women's rights and women's matters. And for all the men here to turn up to that meeting and make sure it's defended.
Well, one of the things I'm fairly confident about, Jakob pointed out earlier, that one of the first people to be prosecuted under the Race Relations Act was a black Briton. And I'm fairly confident that one of the first people to be prosecuted under the new Misogyny Act, if it passes, will be a woman. And believe me, we'll be there defending that woman.
I don't think we've heard the word woke. And dare I bring it up, but I think I'm intrigued, especially Jacob, why it's not a word you used in your lecture. It's a terribly easy word, I think, for all of us to rally behind, to say, oh, let's beat the woke, we don't like the woke, etc., etc. It's often followed up by someone saying, for want of a better word. So I want to know, Jacob, if you think there is a better word than woke, whether you think it's a particularly useful word, or whether you think it's actually just a divisive word which gets us nowhere and causes a lot more argument than it's worth.
One of the things that I'm very apprehensive about in free speech discussions is that sometimes what motivates people to support free speech is a particular cause. We can get so riled up about that cause that we're willing to abandon principles. So we think of the woke as such a huge threat that we need to adopt illiberal tactics, because and that is the same way that people who are anti-racist think. They see a threat, immense threat against minorities, and so they don't see themselves as authoritarians. They see themselves as fighting for good value, the same way that the Catholic Church thought it was fighting for the good when it was trying to purge heretical ideas. One of the problems with free speech, I think, is that unlike religion or nationalism, it doesn't provide the same degree of social coherence and glue between human beings that sort of thick notions of nationalism and religion do. So we tend to rally around free speech when we are being attacked. So when women are being attacked for expressing particular views, but once the problem of free speech becomes something else that we don't really feel about, or when it's expressions that we actually loathe, then free speech suddenly becomes this very abstract theoretical principle, and we're not willing to invest so much in it. So that's why I'm not advocating free speech because I'm against the woke or others. I see a lot of threats towards free speech from the right, actually from conservatives on the right, and I see a lot of people, especially in an American context, about people who talk about cancel culture, who talk about the woke, who are extremely illiberal, who want to advance laws limiting free speech in universities and so on. That's why I'm sort of a free speech purist. Unfortunately, might not be the best way to sort of create a mass movement, because it's much easier to do that when you have an underlying case that you are advancing. But I think in the long run, it's really important to be principled, because if you're not principled, then you're not really advancing free speech. You are advancing your underlying position, and that might be very just in that particular moment. But if you're not advancing free speech purely principled, you're not actually advancing free speech.
Are feminists really serious about free speech, or just like Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance? Is it a case of free speech for me, but not for thee? Because all these tactics that are used by the trans lobby against feminists, they didn't invent them. They were used by feminists to shut down men's rights activists and men's advocates all over Europe and in America as well.
Very controversial. So let's.
Can I just mention one?
Sure.
I would say my favorite. There are two women who, Olympe de Gouges, who wrote a declaration for the rights of women, and who was executed for her views under the French Revolution. She was a remarkable. So in 1788, she wrote an abolitionist play that had to be stopped because it was heckled by those in favor of slavery. So I think she was someone who was pretty principled about free speech. She said ominously that if women have the right to be guillotined, they should have the right to debate, and she was, of course, guillotined herself. So there are certainly feminists throughout history who have been very principled about free speech. But I think we also have to say that human beings have a default tendency towards intolerance in many ways, and free speech and tolerance is this very fragile patch that we have developed, but every time we sense that the ideas that we hold the most dear or our institutions are under threat, we have to work very hard not to sort of revert to our default position of intolerance. So that's part of the human psyche, and we're not solely motivated by the abstract principle of free speech. We're a very complicated species, and we're motivated by a lot of other competing interests and pathologies, and some of the things that go on inside our brains are not particularly pretty and are certainly not principled. And so we have to guard that vigilantly all the time if we're serious about advancing free speech.
I wondered if we could ask Gillian to respond to that point. Gillian is a best-selling author who lost her publishing contract when she included "I stand with J.K. Rowling" in her Twitter feed, and Gillian is someone that we are supporting. We're hoping that she'll be able to sue her publisher, and we've currently got a crowdfunder which I would encourage you to donate to so we can successfully pursue that case. But Gillian, have you just been red-pilled by your experience? Is your commitment to free speech temporary while it's in your particular interest, or is it more principled?
I'm agreeing with everything Jakob is saying. And yes, go ahead and men's rights activists, say what you think, and then we can argue against you. You know, I know. I'm not saying you are, but I'm just saying that yes, it's the old thing. If we don't know what your arguments are, if you don't know what you're thinking, we can't argue against it. So no, I'm totally free speech.
Jakob, I wanted to ask you this. You mentioned Obama's alignment with the anti-misinformation cause, which, in his view and the view of many others, poses a real threat to democracy. Why is it that the argument of the Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, made over more than 50 years ago, when faced with exactly that argument, we can't allow people to say things that are false in the public square because that corrupts the democratic debate. That means that people are going to vote in a misinformed way. His response was, the best remedy for bad speech is not less speech, but more speech. And sunlight is the best disinfectant. Why has that argument been lost? Why do people like Obama think that actually big tech states need to be suppressing misinformation about things like the pandemic, climate change, rather than have open debates about these things in the public square? Why has that argument got such traction, particularly in the last couple of years?
I think it has a lot to do with social media, because even though in theory, before the internet, we all had the same right to free speech, but in practice, there would be a privileged class of journalists, editors, politicians, and intellectuals who framed the debate, who had a privileged voice in affairs, and who also decided who could speak. I mean, I'm sure you could go down the Royal Mile and stand on a soapbox and say things, but you would have a limited audience. Social media and the internet has upended that, so that has changed the role of the traditional institutional gatekeepers. And as I mentioned in my initial remarks, time and time again, we see that when the public sphere is being expanded, there's an existential dread on the part of those with the privileged access to the public sphere of the unwashed mob, of what will happen. And in many ways, it's extremely patronizing to they are the decision makers. Their whole legitimacy comes from the people they represent, and at the same time, they then say, well, the people who we represent should perhaps not be allowed to hear all viewpoints and should not be allowed to say things that are untrue. And we, by the way, get to define what is the truth. So I think laws against misinformation and disinformation are incredibly pernicious, but also sort of one of the oldest thing. I think, go back to Henry VIII, and you had about 3 or 4 different laws aimed at false information. So it's one of the oldest tactics in the book, and I'm quite worried that has propped up and become legitimate again. Think about the European Union. Overnight almost, the European Commission decided to ban not only Russian disinformation, not only remove the broadcast licensing of RT and Sputnik, which are pretty reprehensible media outlets, I'll give them that, but also saying to Google, you have to delist all search results coming up with RT Sputnik content. You have to block users on social media platforms from. So if I'm sitting in Denmark and I look up RT Sputnik, that will not come up on my social media platform. So even if I want to debunk Russian propaganda, I'm not being allowed to do that. And they've decided that overnight. That I think is extremely frightening because it sets an incredibly pernicious precedent. Once it's established, what's the next thing that can be decided top down by politicians with no debate, very questionable legal basis. So this is and it doesn't matter whether it's climate change or the pandemic or any other subject. That has to be open to public debate. If we decide that ordinary people cannot be trusted to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong, like a critical mass of people cannot, then there's no basis for a democracy. Then, as Jim said, the foundation is rotten to the core, and we might as well bulldoze the house.
So do you think we're going to have potentially these two levels of sort of who you are is going to stop you from speaking, and what you say is also going to stop you from speaking?
Fear is now a major factor in non-dialogue. Actually, I mean, when you have senior politicians terrified when they're asked to define a woman,
Yes.
I mean, it's funny, but it's tragic. It is quite extraordinary. They are afraid, and so I think we have a major problem. I think you're right about victimhood. There's lots of groups volunteer themselves or are volunteered. I mean, I was listening to someone who was black, who was really very, very upset when he said, all black people are the same. We've got opinions individually, but you keep putting us in a box called black. And so I don't think it's minorities, most of them, who volunteer to be the victims. I think they're chosen to be the victims, and then you get virtue signalling. But this fear factor actually has to be addressed, and it has to be challenged. And that's where leadership, willpower comes in. You've got to have the ability to stand up and say, this is what I believe. If you don't like it, hard luck. That sounds very simple, but most politicians are afraid to say that, at the present time. So I don't know how we break out of this. I must tell you, I'm in a very depressed state at the moment because of the condition of Scottish politics. We're in a state of stasis. We've got a government which has captured civic society. And there's no question about that whatsoever. I mean, I know one organisation which has a reputation as being forceful about this, that, and the next thing, especially housing. When the Scottish Government, in a budget, cut social housing by £641 million, all that it responded with was a statutory one single message. No campaign, no constant saying this is wrong, this must be reversed, because they've been bought, basically. And actually inside the SNP, I'm in it, but not of it at the present time. Inside the SNP, this is really quite important to understand this. Inside the organisation, the National Executive, which in my time was the key organ of the party, now has a majority of people who are not elected by the National Conference, but are actually nominees of special interest groups. And that's the way civic society has in fact been captured in Scotland. And we do have a much more difficult time ahead of us than folk in England. I mean, one of the arguments I've always had for independence, and I'm sorry to upset the unionists, but one of the arguments is small countries can be very flexible. But I've also come to realise small countries can be very easily captured. And that's what happens.
One of the arguments, I think, that I'm going to use the word, sorry Sam, that woke often make, is that they're on the right side of history. That standing up for these historically disadvantaged groups, restricting free speech, standing up for equality, diversity and inclusion, they're on the right side of history. And if you oppose what they're doing, if you challenge them, you're on the wrong side of history. And that I think is a very powerful argument. One of the reasons I think that so many institutions have allowed themselves to be captured by this particular social justice intersectional ideology is because they think that is the direction in which history is going. And if they oppose it, I think with trans rights, people think that opposing trans rights, opposing any aspect of the agenda of trans rights activists is the equivalent of opposing gay rights 50 years ago. And if they risk opposing it, challenging it, they'll end up on the wrong side of history. It's a powerful rhetorical argument. Are people like us on the wrong side of history? You've just written a history of free speech. Is it just an anomaly? Is the human default position to actually not tolerate challenge and disagreement, but to shut it down in however nasty a way we can, because we don't like people trespassing on our sacred values. It offends our sense of community and solidarity. What was the golden age of free speech over the past 200 years or so, until quite recently? Was that a historical anomaly? Are we on the wrong side of history?
I hope not. It certainly, throughout most of human history, there certainly have not been free speech. But I am actually fairly confident that in open, liberal, consolidated democracies, the culture of free speech still has such a depth that people will react. So I think if the hate crime bill enters into force and you'll see sort of 10 obviously absurd cases, I think the backlash, or at least I hope so, will mean that people can see this is absurd. And I think there's a great potential also that when people start realizing that restrictions on free speech are a bit like using poison gas, that you throw them at the enemy, but then it blows back and affects yourself, that might make people think twice. And then I also, to a large extent, I think we take the benefits of free speech for granted and obsess about the harms and the ugly sides. But when we start to see that the things that we take for granted cannot actually be taken for granted, I think that's when we start to think twice. So sometimes, unfortunately, we need these shocks to the system to realize how precious a right it is. And I think people can see that now, for instance, in the conflict with Ukraine. Look at the draconian crackdowns in Russia. Like, you really start seeing this is what a society that is becoming totalitarian looks like. So maybe it's not a good idea for European democracies also to introduce light versions of that. You see what's going on in China, and we start sort of, well, what is it that makes us different from these kinds of society? Well, one of the most important things is that we enjoy the right to free speech. And I think that we will also see, as these kind of laws on hate speech and so on are being expanded, there will inevitably be situations where they're being used by groups against each other. And I think that free speech race to the gutter will reveal the ugly side of censorship and will make even groups, minority groups who hope to benefit from these laws, think twice about them. So I think there is ground for optimism. But as I said, the history of free speech is never won or lost. It's a continuous battle, and it's up to us each day to wake up and be convinced about the benefits.
Well, join me in thanking Jakob, thanking Tim, thanking Jamie, and a big thank you to Jan and Kate for organising this evening. Please have a drink on us. Thank you all very much for coming. Solidarity.